Good morning. My name is Marisol Dision, and I'm the Managing Director at Women of Influence Plus. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today's conversation is focused on allyship, specifically the role men can play in advancing equity at work. While the topic isn't new, what continues to evolve is our understanding of what effective allyship looks like in practice. We are joined by two of the leading voices on this subject, Dr. Brad Johnson and Dr. David Smith, researchers, educators, and trusted advisors to Fortune 500 companies, the military, and academic institutions. They are also co-authors of Good Guys and Athena Rising, two of the most widely referenced books on gender partnership and allyship in the workplace. Good morning, and thank you for joining us, Brad and David.
Glad to be here, Marcel.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Marcel.
Wonderful. So before we get started, just some housekeeping to our valued audience members. Please do share your questions and comments in the comments section, and we will try to get some of your Q&A during today's session. Okay, I actually wanted to start off with a quick chat we were having prior to hopping on live. We were chatting about how much we wanted the audience to represent both men and women today, but we had some trouble getting some men to join us. Now, is this common, and what could we be doing better to invite men to this conversation?
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I think it's a great one that we were having, and I think that one of the things is the challenge of understanding where men belong in this space, and I think this is one of the things that we often talk about is that there is we need to be very explicit about what that looks like and what those roles include, but also to include the idea that there's also not just a role, but there's benefits that go with that in terms of how we can become better, and that as people, as leaders, as managers, as colleagues in the workplace, and this is where, again, being part of this conversation, I think, is an important part of it as we develop awareness and understanding, really about how other people may be experiencing the workplace, but also how we can come alongside and we can begin to think about how we can collaborate and partner to create better workplaces, better relationships in the workplace as well.
Yeah, and I would just add, we have not done a good job, Marcel, sharing with men the data about what's in it for them when they're good at this. When men show up as inclusive leaders, it's often good for their careers. When men show up as better partners with women, both at home and in the workplace, they enjoy their relationships more. They tend to be more engaged with their children. There's a lot in this for all of us, but we've tended to frame this as just for women. And I'm afraid that messaging has suggested to men that this is not for you.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're going to get into some of that data during this conversation, but how about we start with providing some clarity? So, what exactly is male allyship in the workplace, and what is it not?
Mm.
Yeah. Well, Dave, why don't you talk about the three levels, and then I want to just share a bit about transparency.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to level the playing field. I think because again, lots of people have different ideas about what allyship is or isn't, and who are allies, and am I an ally, and am I doing a good job at that? Again, the words become very popular, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, and I think one of the things that we started with was beginning to think about how we can operationalize, really get down to very specific sets of actions and behaviors so that it becomes very tactical and practical in terms of how we think about these, and we can see it, right, feel it and touch it each day. And so the first part we think about these actions is really the interpersonal, and thinking about every day, how do we show up as colleagues, and in the relationships that we have in the workplace as collaborators, and being participative and really collegial and working together. What does that look like? If you have different types of fair equity or fairness initiatives in your workplace, how do you show up in those spaces? If you have an employee resource group, for example, if you're a part of that, or if you're trying to become a part of an employee resource group, even though you don't necessarily identify with that group, how do you show up as an ally? What does that look like? A lot of this is really back to holding yourself accountable for developing your own awareness and understanding of how people may experience the workplace differently, so that we can begin to think about how we can collaborate to make it better. And that's the first part. The harder part of allyship that we heard so much from a lot of the men that we've interviewed has really been about the public allyship. And this is where not just holding yourself accountable for doing this work, but how do you hold other people accountable as well? And that can be everything from doing great public advocacy work to disrupting or confronting when we see something that doesn't land right or doesn't sound quite right, and trying to make that better. But that means not holding just yourself accountable, but holding maybe your peers and leaders accountable as well. And that can feel very uncomfortable. And this is where a lot of the men said that they felt like they were really putting some skin in the game because they were beginning to accept public responsibility for this work. And then, of course, I think the final part of this gets to more of a structural or systemic aspect of allyship and thinking about how do we create this change so that it works for lots of people, not just in a specific, not reactive in a moment, not for just one person, but for many people. And that requires a deeper level of understanding of how a bias can operate in an everyday practice that can create these structural inequities. So like a wage gap or a lack of representation in senior leadership positions. So understanding the processes or the practices that are leading to that, and it's not always one, it's usually many, then I can begin to think about how do I collaborate to work to change that practice so it works for everyone. And so doing all of that together, and again, we can focus on this from a gender perspective. This also can be expanded to other dimensions around diversity and identities that we have, and thinking about how we do this in a variety of different ways.
And just one thing I'll tag on, Maricel, is this has to be collaborative. When we're talking about allyship, especially around gender, men as allies, this can't be men getting together deciding, hey, what are we going to do for women? We hear too much of that, right? Guys doing this soloed stuff about how they're going to show up and maybe, in the worst case scenario, rescue women or kind of do the, the chivalrous sort of behavior. Really not helpful versus coming alongside, collaborating, thinking about how do we go there together. That's really what allyship has got to be about.
Now I'm going to go, I have a list of questions here, but I want to veer off script just slightly here. So what does collaboration look like? When you have a group of folks who want to make the workplace better for everybody and the workplace experience better for everybody, where do you start? How do you start with acknowledging the different perspectives and viewpoints and experiences, developing that self-awareness? It seems like quite a large or quite a tall hill to climb.
Yeah, it does. And I think often where men have gotten it wrong, trying to do more of this work or be better in this space, they have this assumption that, well, I need to show up and fix things, right? I need to show up. Maybe it's a women's ERG, the Women's Employee Resource Group. I go to one of their events. It's open to men. And, I hear about some of the gendered headwinds. So I immediately want to jump in and maybe mansplain to women there how they should pursue gender equity or how they should run the ERG or how they should lobby for different benefits in the company. Really the wrong optic versus showing up and, as you suggested, Maricel, listening. I want to listen and learn because a lot of this will be new to me. As a male, I don't encounter these headwinds. So I need to learn. I need to self-educate, right? There are so many great podcasts and books and so much research on gender difference in the workplace and gender disparity. So self-educate and then start checking in with women. Hey, I was learning about this. Is this part of your experience here in our company? Would you be willing to share? Kind of doing what Dave and I call the ask to ask. So learning more, showing up with curiosity, and then at some point ask, what role could I play that would be most helpful? I don't want to make assumptions about that. I don't want to become the spokesman for the group, but I really am curious about what behavior would be most useful.
That's really important. I think that when someone feels like they need to support or do something, it connects right back to what action specifically, what can I do? And to your point, Brad, the first thing that you should do is maybe take a beat and listen. What's being said, what opinions are being shared. And we're getting quite a few comments in the comment section, which is fantastic. And it's prompting me to jump to a question about what does good allyship actually look like in practice? A lot of audience members are asking for specific examples. What does it look like in a meeting, in a performance review, in decision making?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the places we often find a lot of the challenges, or again, some of these biased comments or behaviors often happen in group settings, right? And meetings is unfortunately one of those places that we all have to deal with. And sometimes it can be a little bit different in a virtual setting, right? A virtual meeting than an in-person meeting, but a lot of times some of those are very much the same. And we ask allies to think about this from a as you begin to develop an awareness and understanding of what some of these sound like and look like, so you can notice them in real time, and then stay attuned to them and have a list of questions kind of in your head that are kind of running through, so that help you stay attuned to these types of behaviors. And so everything around, well, who was invited to the meeting, who was included, who got a seat at the table, who's getting lots of airtime to make their contributions and who might not be getting any, who's being interrupted 3 times as often as somebody else, and who's having their ideas valued and who might not be, they may not be even hearing them at all, or having them stolen even in some cases. And I know that it's really interesting as we develop awareness and understanding of how these things play out and what they look like in real time, that we also learn some of the language that goes with it, because they are so prevalent for certain groups of people, especially women. And Brad and I certainly heard a lot of those as we were going through our interviews and our research. And so we learned the language that goes with it too. And that one about ideas being stolen sometimes is called bro-appropriation, when men steal women's ideas. But it just goes to show you how prevalent it can be in that case. But being attuned to it, right? Being able to see it and hear it in real time when it's happening is just part of the solution, right? Because then you can decide how you want to handle it right there. And what would an ally do at that moment? And in some cases, right, might be stepping up and just saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm sorry, Brad. Really, I'd like to hear the rest of Maricel's, her thoughts and ideas there. I think she's really onto something. Or if it was a stolen idea of, wait a minute, how is that any different than what Maricel just said? And or even just amplifying it, right? Just amplifying a great idea, making sure that we're being a little more proactive in terms of making sure people get valued and get credit for their contributions and their ideas. And so in some ways, I think we start with some of the reactive pieces of it, because it's just, as I just begin to notice it, I haven't really thought about how I want to be proactive about it. But I think eventually we want to get to the point where we're proactive and making sure that we can put some procedures or process or practices in place that help to deter some of that. And so if somebody's not having their voice heard, make sure that we're going around the table and we're pulling people's ideas and making sure they get a chance to speak and be heard, and show that we value your contribution there. But again, I think we start with the reactive and hopefully get to the proactive eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Just a couple others of my favorites. Interpersonally, we mentioned listening, but do you also work on your assumptions about women? What women will want or not want in their careers simply because they're women? I think men get into trouble with that, versus actually checking in with her and asking what her ideal career trajectory looks like. What's the ideal balance between work and caregiving? I don't want to make assumptions about her. I want to actually listen, find out. How about passing the friend test, right? You can be a great listener and a great interpersonal friend with a woman at work, and then she finds out that, in the break room when it's all men, you're laughing at sexist jokes, you're joining in all kinds of inappropriate banter. I'm sorry, if you do that, you're going to be outed very quickly as a performative ally. You need to be consistent both privately and publicly in the way you show up here. How do you receive feedback, right? Are you open? Do you welcome it? Do you not get defensive? Do you not gaslight her? Are you somebody who surrounds yourself with kind of a core group of people who trust you enough that they're going to give you that feedback, right? Often women, because maybe I'm going to step in it, very likely as a human being, I will sometime. Are there women who trust me enough that say, hey, Brad, today when you said that in the meeting, no, it landed the wrong way. Let me just tell you why. I got to be somebody who welcomes it and goes looking for that feedback and then uses it to actually change my behavior.
What I'm hearing is that it doesn't come in one sweeping action, of course, in one, shining night moment in a meeting or in a performance review. These are intentional adjustments made both online, in person, through all kinds of communication. It's just about being intentional and conscious about how you're carrying yourself as an ally and identifying as that. Would that be accurate to kind of take away from what you've shared?
Yeah, I think so. I think in each the settings or the contexts of where these happen, whether it's in a performance review, whether it's in a meeting, whether it's in a briefing, or whatever the situation or the context is, there's always these dynamics that play out. And being attuned to them and looking for opportunities, right, to be able to support, to advocate for people, I think is really the name of the game.
Mhm.
Yeah, and just one quick follow-up there. Dave and I do a lot of workshops on skill development, right, for aspiring allies, and occasionally we have men in particular say, "Hey, when do I get the certificate, the certification that I'm an ally?" And we're always reminding them, "Dude, you never get one of those. This is a journey. We're always learning. We're always iterating, making mistakes. So you gotta show up with that kind of humility, right? There's not a destination here."
Absolutely. I like that. It is a journey. There is no certificate of completion at the end. There is no end of this, right? It's ongoing and it evolves. Let's get into the why. So, why is allyship for men not just valuable, but essential to equity in the workplace?
Well, I'll begin just with a study, and I know Dave will have some thoughts on this. There's so much research in answer to your question, Maricel. One of the studies Dave and I often point to was a huge study by Boston Consulting Group a few years ago, going out across lots of companies, professions, industries, asking thousands of women. Among all the questions, this key question is your organization making real progress on the inclusion of women in the workplace? And the number one predictor of whether women said yes or no to that important question was whether or not they saw men in their organization leaning in and partnering, collaborating, showing up as allies. When that was the case, 97% or 92% of women said, "Yep, my company's moving forward. I see the progress," versus only 30% when women didn't see men engaging, taking it seriously. So if you want to know why men need to be at the table and in the conversation, this is why, right? We're the lion's share of the holders of power, position in most companies and organizations. So if we're not collaborating, we have a long way to go to get there.
Mhm.
Yeah, and in trying to reach some sort of gender balance in our industries and professions today, I think is a lot of the goal. Because again, as Brad said, we're looking at, as you look across the spectrum of any form of creativity, of intelligence, of productivity, of performance, right? It's a bell curve, right? And so 50% of that is women, and if we don't have that in our organizations, we're missing out, right? We're missing out on the opportunity for our business, for our company, to accomplish our mission, to whatever that is, and as well as for those people, right? We're missing out on the opportunity to engage them and allow them to be as productive as we would like them to be. And I think the other part that we started this conversation with at the very beginning here was back to hey, this is good for men too, right? And that's what the research shows us, that when men show up and they become better, they develop these skill sets as allies in the workplace. They have increased access to information. They have more diverse networks. They have more empathy. They have more emotional intelligence, better communication skills. And we do see that as you look into recent research with more senior leaders today. We're seeing that whole suite of skill sets start to be the set of traits and skills that are most valued and are the ones that are getting people to the highest levels of leadership. The interesting thing about that is, so things like humility and empathy and vulnerability and authenticity are things that have long been the hallmarks of women's leadership, right? And so again, we're late to the game here, but as guys, they're starting to figure this out and learn, and this is part of it. Being a great ally, being an inclusive leader, helps you to develop those skill sets. And again, we can get to better gender balance sooner.
And staying on this research tail, what does the research tell us? Oh, sorry, the interviews with women is actually one I wanted to chat about.
Um,
What did you hear from your interviews with women? What do they say they need most from their male colleagues and men in leadership right now?
Wow, there are a lot of things. I'll just start with a few, and I think it's okay to just focus on the current headwinds, maybe in the last several months that we're all seeing when it comes to policies and executive orders and pushback to programs and including programs that have been working really well when it comes to building representation of women in the workplace, advancement of women. We're seeing all the pushback right now. So, how can leaders, especially those of us who are men, show up right now? Number one, you have to be courageous enough to talk about what's going on. If you're silent right now when you know certain portions of your workplace population are likely to be suffering or feeling unsafe, it's no way to show up as a leader. So, are you acknowledging what's going on? Are you willing to say, hey, this is not okay? Are you willing to check in, have listening sessions, for example, with key groups of people in your organization? Maybe it's women, and just find out how are they doing right now? How can your organization be more supportive given everything that's going on? But I'm not going to remain silent. If I just took an example like pushback on women's reproductive rights and healthcare and access to those things, are you courageous enough to say, hey, this is not okay? I'm concerned about how women in our organization are feeling right now. I want you to feel like we have your back. And I'm wondering what we can do in the context of all the legal stuff going on to make you feel as supported as we can. That takes some courage. I got to put some skin in the game to do that. I'm going to predict that if you're not willing to do that, you're going to see some attrition of high talent women. And I also think you're not getting the best from those women while they're in your organization.
Yeah, I think right on the spot there, and the courage piece is so important. And we often talk with senior leaders about this. That again, women, they want senior leaders to talk with authenticity, right, and come from. So tell us what you really think, right? What's your personal example about why this is important to you? Clarity of message, strategic messaging, right, to different groups of people, and having leaders be very, again, be very upfront and open about why this is important to them. Because I think there's a question, especially with male leaders, about when they're talking about it, are you really being sincere, or is this authentic for you? And when you tell a personal story, a personal example, people know that that's coming from the heart. And then I think the flip side of that is making sure that we expand that conversation when we have the opportunity to other audiences of, for example, other managers, junior people in the organization who are listening to that senior leader. Make sure we talk about why this is important for them too, why it's important that they do this work, and how they can be kind of connected to their own motivation, their own personal narrative around this doing this work. The other one that women told us, I think loud and clear, was we want some accountability. And we have to have, we want to see leaders held accountable for doing this work, and we want to see the measurement and the metrics and the progress. And if it's not going, the way we designed it to, then let's talk about why, and what are the corrections, what are the changes we need to make to get there, and have some accountability at every level of leadership along the way. And then I think finally, the other one that women told us a lot about was transparency. And this is, now we're talking about organizational transparency in terms of both the work we're doing to create equity in the workplace, fairness in the workplace for them, and to correct some of the things that are going on there, to create that change that they're looking for. But also, again, just kind of showing that progress, being transparent about, hey, maybe things aren't exactly the way we wanted them to go, but here's what we're going to do to make that better. And again, very specifically, sometimes this also deals with some of the very specific employment processes, everything from promotions. I can't tell you how many organizations we've gone into, and women have told us that I just don't really have a clear understanding of how the promotion process works here to the next level for me. I don't know what the next steps are. It's just not clear. It's not written down. I don't know who to talk to get that information. Pay transparency, something that is rampant across our country. Lots of organizations today have this lack of transparency about pay in so many different ways and how that works. And again, the more secrecy, the less transparency we have, the less trust we have in the organization and our leaders. And so we need to be talking about it. We need to show, and we need to develop more transparency across the organization and all the different ways that are important to us.
Absolutely. David, when you mentioned promotions, that
Yeah.
triggered a question in me about sponsorship. So
Mm.
we'll often hear or say, women are over mentored but under sponsored. And you've written about the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. So could you talk a little bit about why this distinction is critical, and how can men in leadership step into both roles with intention and care and as an ally?
Yeah, absolutely. And this gets back to what we think of as kind of the public part of allyship. And so your roles as advocates. And so those can be in informal or formal roles. And so we think about sponsorship being a more formal part of allyship and advocacy and doing that. And one of the challenges is that because women are often not in the room, in the places where these key decisions are being made about the next opportunity, the next leadership position, the next step up. We're doing all the different planning, succession planning. If you're not in the room, you don't have a voice. So again, why do men need to be part of the conversation? Because they need to be there and talking about her and putting her name forward when she's not in the room, and making sure we're doing that. So that can happen. Again, that can happen every day in terms of kind of more, I think of as a little less formal advocacy or sponsorship. But then there's the more formal notion of sponsor, and sometimes we know who our sponsors are, and sometimes we don't. But in many cases, when we do, is making sure that we start back with the awareness piece and understanding of all the key traits and values and the things that are so important about this person, and why we need them on the team and why I value them, so I can talk about them in that way. I can talk about their key strengths and why they'd be so perfect for this next position that's out there, but also understanding kind of where they're looking to go with their career, and not making too many assumptions. Again, I think from an ally perspective, Brad mentioned the assumptions is a key part, right? Not making an assumption that, hey, just because she's a woman, she must want this, or that she wants to follow in the same footsteps as I have, or whatever the case might be. But just don't make those assumptions. Make sure it's very clear in your mind where she wants to go with her career, so that you can support her in that, and you can help and advocate for that when she's not there and not in the room. But also, I think understanding the key components around what are the things she needs, maybe we all have gaps in our resumes. We have places where we can strengthen that. It can prepare us for the next step of where we're trying to get to, and how we can set people up for success in that way. At the same time, when there's opportunity and we collect things like feedback, we were talking about, you mentioned performance reviews earlier. Make sure that we're getting that feedback to them in an actionable, direct way that they can do something with. When we're not sugarcoating it, we're not hiding it. We're making sure that we're bringing that to them in the same way we would for other people, for men, for example, to make sure that we're allowing her to use that, right, to her advantage to move forward.
And maybe, excuse me, just to recap, the mentor sponsor distinction. I think we're talking about allyship, Maricel. The mentoring is more the interpersonal, and it's so important that men show up as mentors, taking the initiative to begin those relationships with women in the workplace. You look at most professions, industries, organizations, the farther you go up in leadership, it's mostly men. If you expect the few women in your company to do all the mentoring of junior women, it is not fair, right? And a lot of those talented junior women are going to drop through the cracks. So men have got to be active. They've got to take initiative. I think men sometimes make this more awkward than they need to. They don't know how this mentoring conversation might unfold, and number one, they might do something awkward like say, hey, I'd like to mentor you, right? Use their creepy voice like I just did. And instead of that, how about just saying, hey, I've noticed this terrific work you're doing, or I saw you in that meeting give that presentation last week. Boy, I was thinking we're really lucky to have you here. If you ever want to talk about next steps in the organization, feel free to drop by. I've got an open door. that is not a heavy lift, right? Easy, but I need to take initiative to start those mentoring conversations and then show up and be consistent. And then, as Dave said, let's get to that next level, which I think can happen in the same relationship, sponsorship. Now, do you become her raving fan, as Dave said? Talk about her
Mhm.
when she's not even in the room.
Can we dig in a little bit more about some of those barriers, whether they're internal or cultural in the workplace, that keep men from engaging more deeply in this work?
Yeah, boy, how long's your program?
I mean,
There's
I
so
got time.
well, I'll just start with a few. When Dave and I were doing the research for Athena Rising, we found so many reasons why men don't engage in relationships with women in the workplace, whether it's mentoring or friendships or anything else. It includes anxiety. I don't want to step in it, don't want to say the wrong thing. Maybe I'm afraid of rumors or gossip if I start mentoring a junior woman. Maybe I've got implicit bias. I just don't, I see women as nice, but not leaders. If that's going on with me, I'm not offering developmental relationships. And then, men can get weird about Me Too and have false notions about that. Me Too is straightforward. Women would love to come to work and not be assaulted or harassed. Super low bar for men. But instead of that, you may hear from men that women are dangerous or not safe. So I've got to push back on all of that. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I'm always reminding men, if you have anxiety about anything, including women, there's only one treatment. It's called exposure therapy: more engagement, more coffee, more mentoring. That's the way you overcome that. But don't make that her problem. You need to work on your own anxiety.
Mhm.
I think that risky investment piece underlying all of that we haven't made very explicit at this point is the caregiving side of things. And so many times we hear this, right? There's the, whether we're talking about the motherhood penalty, the pregnancy bias, right there, it goes on, but these assumptions that, again, that are made, that women are not as committed, right, to their work and to their careers, and so therefore we shouldn't invest in them in the same way we do for men, and that's holding us back. And we've got to get past that and understand, one, our roles as caregivers and what that looks like. And this goes not only for women, but for men too. And we need to be open about who we are as caregivers and begin talking about that too, because there is stigma associated with it for men as caregivers in the workplace as well. But again, so many times I think there are assumptions that are made because she's a woman or because she's a mother or a caregiver in some way, or even if we don't even know if she's a caregiver, we just make assumptions she either will be or is, and we just don't know about it at this point, that she doesn't have the capacity, she doesn't have the capability, the resources, the commitment, to do that, or I'm going to lose her along the way if I invest in her in doing this.
Mhm. So, how do we move from individual actions to creating cultures of allyship? What's required for that to be sustainable as well? Another layer to this, and not situational, because oftentimes what might happen in a workplace is a situation will arise, action needs to be taken to correct or alleviate any tensions as a result of that situation, but it doesn't become ingrained in the culture.
Mhm.
So, I apologize for asking you to be very prescriptive, but this can feel very complex and overwhelming to some folks who might not be familiar with the work. How can we move from individual to cultural impact?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single one way to do this. I think what we're seeing is lots of organizations today are attempting to do this in a variety of different ways that align with maybe the mission or the industry that they're in. So, for example, a lot of different industries today have leadership development programs that are internal for the most part to their organization. The nice thing about those is they often have them where when you move up to the next level, then you go through another leader development program, right, to prepare you for that and for that role. When you can include these types of skill-based behaviors and training and education as part of that leader development program, that's when it becomes more cultural, because now everybody who's moving up through the company is getting that, right? And so they're seeing that as, now this is the norm, this is the expectation, this is how I'm supposed to manage and to lead my people out there. And so when we integrate it into kind of a normal process of the organization, it has a tendency to become much more normalized in that way and create those group norms that we're looking for. And hopefully everybody is moving up through that and getting that along the way. It's not focused on anybody in particular, just people in their normal process of moving along. Indoctrination is another way. So onboarding and indoctrination, if you back up a step, how do we do this culturally for everybody? Often we get a chance to do this when people are onboarded. And how do companies do that? And so again, we're seeing more companies today find ways to talk about introductory ways of norms of how we interact as colleagues, right? Not necessarily from a managerial perspective, but just what are the behaviors? What are the ways we do this every day? How do we attach it to some of the things that are most important to who we are in our company? Use the cultural language and names that you have inside your company that are specific to what it is you do every day. And I think that's a great way to start thinking about it. And then expand, look into other places. What are other programming that you do? Maybe you already have formalized programs around mentoring or formalized programs around sponsoring. Again, these are places where you can do training and education with the mentors and with the sponsors to think about how they can incorporate these behaviors that we're talking about now. And again, that gets infused into the people that they're doing that with. So their mentees, their proteges. And when they become mentors and when they become sponsors, right, this begins to grow and to develop and become much more about this is just who we are in our company, right? This is what we do every day.
Two last things, Maricel. Number one, leaders, especially leaders who are men, have got to show up and be loud and proud and clear about the value of a gender-balanced workplace and a genuinely gender-inclusive workplace. If you're doing this performatively as a male leader, you show up at the International Women's Day celebration, which may be tea and cookies, and give your little 5-minute spiel and then run off to a more important meeting. I'm sorry, that's not leading on this. Are you transparent about your why? Are you talking about why this matters for the success of your organization? Do you go to ERG events and other opportunities to support and talk about women in leadership? If you're not doing it throughout the organization, I'm sorry, it's performative leadership. And then finally, we need to be honest about not promoting men who don't get it, right? We do this too often. We promote superstars who produce these results, but oftentimes are toxic, or they just don't get it and are not really committed to gender inclusion. If that's the case, you're promoting this problem in your own organization. So hold men accountable. Ask them, how are you contributing to our targets or our goals or our aspirations on really getting to more representation of women in meaningful leadership roles? And if you're not mentoring and sponsoring women, you're probably not the right person for this next leadership opportunity. We need somebody who's more inclusive.
Thank you both so much for your candid responses. Our audience members in the comments section are very, very grateful for being so candid and transparent about what allyship truly is when it's not performative, when it's genuine, when it's authentic. There's a lot of comments and questions to go through in the section, but I do want to take the last 5 minutes of our discussion to ask you both a personal question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Why is this work important to you? And if there are men in the audience right now who are listening in but don't have their male colleagues with them joining in, why should they attend the next event that we have on this topic?
Yeah. Well, for why, I can jump in and start, Dave. I am an academic who has spent my whole career studying mentoring relationships and especially what mentees say they most value. And one thing that has always troubled me in the research is the consistent evidence showing that women get less access to mentoring and sponsoring, and particularly women of color, Black women, get less developmental conversation opportunity. It just doesn't happen for them. And I've always been concerned and intrigued and wondered what keeps men on the sidelines, because men because of our majority in leadership roles, we are really part of the solution here. But if we're not engaging, we have a big problem. So that's more of the academic why for me. The personal, I've got one sibling, a sister who followed me into the Navy. I only served for 4 years active duty. My sister served for 30 years. She's a warrior, combat tours, aircraft carrier tours, you name it. And I have listened to her over 30 years talk about things that she encounters that I never did in the same career path, right? I'm never told to smile more, for example. I'm never told that when I give direct feedback, I'm abrasive or emasculating. I'm never told to tone down my performance because I'm coming off as too ambitious. These things just don't happen to me. And I think my relationship with my sister has been a huge eye-opening opportunity for me.
Yeah, for me, it's a little bit of the inverse. Mine started with my from a more personal perspective, with my spouse, my wife, and we had parallel careers in the military, which is where we got our start. And I think one of the things that I noticed very early on was, like Brad said, there were very different experiences for her than there were for me, and we had a lot of those conversations. And it was a lot of the interpersonal, but there's also a lot of the career piece too, and the lack of again, the lack of commitment and focus to taking women seriously in those roles, and not investing in their careers in the same way. And I think for me, having those conversations, it also gave me the opportunity to kind of look back into my own organization and see who else was this affecting, right? So beyond, I had, very had the very personal story from my wife, but also, who was I seeing that I was working with and flying with every day, and how was it impacting them, and recognize very quickly this is such a systemic issue. And it became one of the things that I was always focused on across my career, and in terms of trying to make it better in a variety of different ways. And some of those are just daily practices. And later on, I got the opportunity to work from a policy perspective and shifting and changing policy to make it more equitable for everybody in doing that. And later on, then of course, the research part, as Brad said, for me came front and center, and understanding that, there's actually a lot of great research here that would help us to become better at this. And we can help organizations think about more thoughtfully about how they can structure their organizations in a way that helps people. And so when they have leaders who are willing to create change, to be more successful, to do some of the hard work that we know it takes to make these changes, it's a great opportunity to continue to move forward, and certainly something that we need more broadly across society in our organizations today, is leaders to step up and do what they know is the right thing to do, is actually take the action to create it.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us almost to time, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question if you'll allow me. What is one next step that anyone watching today can take to move from awareness to action, even if that's listening?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe I'll begin. We talked about listening. I love that, Marisol. That's probably, honestly, as a psychologist, where I always begin, but I would encourage men to begin here. Show up and engage in not just listening in the way that you always listen, because men are prone to try to fix things, and that includes fixing women and fixing their problems. But can you just show up as a generous, spacious listener? Try to understand her perspective, things that she may experience that you may not even notice because they don't happen to you. And then can you take that in, for example, to the next meeting, and just start to watch, start to notice. Oh, yeah, she talked about being interrupted constantly, and I never noticed it. But now that I'm watching for it, I see it. And now I can go to her after the meeting and affirm that. Yeah, I saw that too. No, you're not crazy. And now, what role could I play with you that would feel comfortable? Would it be okay if I call that out in the meeting and ask him to hold his thought so you can finish your idea? Do you not want me to do that? What would the best collaborative behavior be? Check in with her and find that out.
And one of those other, to tag on to Brad's, one of those other places you can do that too is also think about if your employee resource groups or affinity groups in your company are open to people who don't necessarily identify, right? So if it's a women's ERG that they don't maybe necessarily identify as women, um, but how can you show up as an ally in that space and join, right? And go practice some of that listening that Brad was talking about there. And then think about eventually getting to that point. You can have that conversation around collaboration and partnership and moving the needle on that. The last one I'll just leave you with is I think it's critically important that we, at some point, we have to address the idea of thinking about domestic allyship, because we really do think that gender equity starts at home. And then if we don't begin to think about our roles as partners, as parents, and how do we show up as an ally at home? And so for men, thinking about how are we doing our fair share, our equity in terms of being fair about the domestic labor that women have done 2 to 3 times as much of over the history of being in these relationships, of doing the childcare, the vast majority of the childcare over time as well. It's no wonder, right, that women have a challenge in terms of advancing in their careers, because if they're doing all of that and the paid work, so the unpaid and the paid work, it's pretty challenging to get there. So we've got to show up and be great allies at home. And the really interesting part about that is that when you start doing that, we find that it changes your behavior at work. So you start to be, again, you start having more empathy for caregivers and to understand that people have other responsibilities outside their paid work life, and that we're trying to integrate and define ways to balance and bring those together in a way that we can accomplish our paid work and our unpaid work. And that we as men and women have to be much more transparent, visible, and vocal in a safe way in our workplace to be able to accomplish that. Because that's when we start talking about it, that's what helps us to normalize it and recognize that, hey, we all have caregiving responsibilities. It's just a matter of how are we going to talk about it and think about integrating that with our work life.
Wonderful. Well, that brings us to time. Thank you so much for that, David. Thank you, Brad, for being here with us today. You have provided us with such great insights and information, and I feel inspired and empowered. And the one key thing that I've taken away from this might seem simple, but it's important work, but we need to do it together in collaboration, in unison, and with some curiosity, and without, those biases, checking those in as much as we can. I will be sure to drop links to Good Guys and Athena Rising in the comments section, and David and Brad's website as well, if you'd like to learn more about them and their important work. Thank you so much again for joining us, David and Brad, and to our valued audience members. We'll see you next time.